So here we are at Module 6, more than halfway through the unit, and the topic for this week is controversies in, or critical debates in restorative justice. In the scheme of things, they're not very big in terms of controversies, but there are various applications of restorative justice that we have stayed away from or have been critically aware of for a while, that we need to think about very clearly before going ahead, because we're in a position where we've got a relatively good amount of success and goodwill behind restorative justice, particularly the youth, in the youth context. But there are some areas where there is significant risk of things going wrong, and we want to make sure we pretty much know what we're doing before we attempt to use the restorative justice processes in these areas, if we ever do. So the first thing we talk about is sexual violence and or gender violence. So we've both got sexual violence and domestic violence as areas which many consider not suitable, not appropriate for restorative processes. Others think that it may well be appropriate, but we've got to tread very, very carefully. And the second part of what we're going to look at is specific types of offender where we have some concerns about the use of the process, and we need more information before we're sure that the process is actually suitable for the offenders and not going to make matters worse in many ways. The first thing I would like to mention is that because we're talking about domestic violence, because we're talking about sexual violence in this unit, that be aware that there's triggering content aplenty here. We're not talking about any specific scenarios, any specific facts, any specific descriptions of those offences, so that's not necessarily going to be a problem, but just be aware that we're talking about those issues. And as the study notes for this week mention, there's a support line at 1-800-RESPECT if you feel as though that the exploration of these themes has raised issues for you that you need some help with. The other source of help is also the university counselling service. There's free counselling for students, which might be worth taking advantage of as well. And as with any of triggering content, you don't necessarily know ahead of time whether or not it's actually going to provide a problem for you. So feel free to, this week in particular, to drop out of the discussion if you're finding that it's causing you distress. However, it's an important area to discuss, so we do need to go ahead there. All right, so we're going to start with domestic violence and some of the issues around use of alternatives in domestic violence situations. Now, I come from a civil mediation background. I was trained as a mediator, and one of the things we were told there was that we never ever mediate massive power imbalances, and we never ever mediate where there's domestic violence. That, of course, has been somewhat loosely applied in the career of mediator since the Australian government has decided that all family matters require compulsory mediation, and of course a lot of those are going to involve not the majority, but a significant portion of those will involve violence of some form or another, and traditionally there's been the dangers of use of any alternative process has meant that we've stayed away from it as a solution. So again, when we're talking about not just about civil things like family law, where we're discussing criminal law, the risks are just as strong. And there's been a lot of work done by Kathleen Daly in this area, and Daly has identified a whole series of both benefits and critiques of the use of restorative justice in this field. Now they're extracted in your materials for this week, so make sure you're aware of those. Daly does, again, like we discussed last week, the conventional justice system is notoriously bad, both for victims of domestic violence and for victims of sexual assault. So we're not in a position where we're going to say, we're happy with the conventional model and we're never ever going to use restorative justice processes, we're never going to use conferencing or whatever, because the current system is not looking like being fixed anytime soon, is already very bad for victims. But we do need, if we are going to push in that area, and some jurisdictions do offer restorative justice in this area, we do have to be aware of the benefits and critiques. So I might quickly run through the critiques. There's an issue of safety that's involved in terms of just having further contact with an offender, and these are specifically about domestic violence, but I think there's a significant overlap with sexual violence, particularly because of the vast number of sexual violence offences that occur where the victim and offender know each other. We like to perpetuate the myth of sexual violence being the rapist hiding in the bushes to capture women who are alone at night or whatever, and that does happen, but the vast majority of sexual assault happens where the victim and offender already know each other. So we need to bear that in mind when we think about this. So yes, there is a potential of the victim and offender putting them together again, that there's an issue of safety, possibly not in the specific context of the conference or the mediation or whatever, but just in terms of them having further contact. There's an issue of power imbalances, and that if you don't actually manage to do something to account for the power imbalances, you can actually deepen that imbalance, make it worse. There's potential for people to manipulate the process. There's a question over the relevance of the genuineness of apologies, particularly, and I don't necessarily mean this in a subjective way from the offender's point of view, but we know about in domestic violence the cycle of violence, and there's always a honeymoon phase. So there's usually, I shouldn't say always, there's usually a honeymoon phase. So there's usually a building of tension, leads to a release of violence, which is then followed by repentance and, I'll never do it again, I'm so sorry, whatever. So we already know that there's the issue of apology is often outside of the control of the offender, and many offenders will sincerely apologise and they'll say they'll never do it again, but then they fall back into the cycles of violence. So using the standard approach where we ask for an apology from the offender just may not cut it in this situation, because they can be as genuine as they like, but we know there's a pattern that offenders fall back into. Other critiques we have is the issue of what good one meeting can do when you've got entrenched patterns that require substantial therapy. There's potential victims are going to be pressured into or coerced into being involved. Uncertainty about the role of the community when we're talking about community involvement. The mixed loyalty of friends and family, and some of the symbolic implications of this is we spent a long time, or activists spent a long time, exposing domestic violence to public scrutiny. Until very recently, it was seen as a private matter, something that police didn't do domestics, they didn't get involved, and people didn't really think it was the same as a criminal matter. Activists spend a long time raising awareness of domestic violence and getting it perceived as a matter of criminal law. And there is a danger that by moving it back into a restorative justice process, that some of that work can be undone, and it can be seen again, as a private, confidential thing rather than as something that should be seen and scrutinised in a public forum. That being said, there are plenty of potential benefits for victims in these cases, and it's therefore probably premature just to say we'll never use restorative justice where there's gendered violence or sexual violence. The potential for greater victim participation, for them to have a voice in the process and the outcome, to be validated. There's a potential, at least, for them to be validated and empowered. A larger degree of offender accountability in terms of actually planning and promising to do things about their behaviour. The process is more flexible, less intimidating for victims. There's greater potential for dialogue, of having the offender actually hear the victim's story, to challenge the offender's denials or the ways in which they minimise harm. And where there's an ongoing relationship, I think this is less relevant where there's sexual assault, but in issues of domestic violence where people do want to continue a relationship, a criminal trial is not actually going to help that process. So subject to all that stuff we said about power imbalances and manipulation of process, but there are victims who are still wanting to have a relationship of some sort with the offender in domestic violence situations. And definitely the restorative justice options are going to give them more scope than your traditional trial process. So there's a lot of issues tied in with both of these themes. Let's separate them before we go further and first concentrate on domestic violence. As I mentioned a little while ago, one of the big problems with getting behavioural change in the area of domestic violence is that cycle of violence, is the honeymoon period, the I'm sorry, it's probably quite a terrible thing to call it a honeymoon period, but anyway. But there is frequently a period where the offender does genuinely want to change their ways, are genuinely repentant for the harm they've done. But we know that because of the larger forces driving that behaviour, it's only a matter of time before they go back. You know, it's a pattern that recurs over and over again. So having your conventional restorative justice approach, where victim and offender meet, offender says they're sorry, they won't do it again, and they're going to do better, and we already kind of do that, and we already know that doesn't work. So in many ways we could be setting a victim up for further harm and further victimization by validating this cycle that we already know doesn't work. Interesting side question there in terms of, does this cycle of violence apply to other areas of violence outside domestic violence? And short answer is we don't know. Long answer is it's something to have a think about. We looked at last week how 60% of offenders in violent cases believed they were giving a sincere apology, and only 30% of victims believed that was a sincere apology. This may be another manifestation of that. There's very limited, because there hasn't been a lot of use of these methods for domestic violence, there's been very limited research, very limited data kept, just because it just doesn't happen that often. But in your notes there's a reference to an article by, I think his name is Tasek. It's Ptacek. And Tasek found that on the data that was available, the process was genuinely beneficial to victims of domestic violence, that they genuinely felt more validated, supported, and they felt that they were safe to speak freely during the processes. They felt that they were treated with respect and felt that offenders were held accountable. So on the limited data we've got, it seems that victims are happier with these processes than they are with conventional processes. But again, we've got to be really wary of that cycle of violence. In terms of sexual violence, we've long been concerned about the re-victimization, the secondary and tertiary victimization of victims of sexual assault. You know, they're primarily a victim of the original assault. There's then secondary victimization when they get reported try to report to the police, and often go through traumatic processes in reporting and not being believed. And then there's the tertiary victimisation, where you go on trial, the offender goes on trial. The Freudian slip there, saying that the victim goes on trial, but it's probably quite true. The offender goes on trial, and then the victim is put on the stand and exposed to cross-examination. And we know there's this whole long history of, really inappropriate cross-examination about, what were you doing in that part of town at night? What were you wearing? What was your behaviour? The blame the victim approach. So we are very hesitant about the use of restorative justice processes where there's sexual violence. However, it does happen in New Zealand, and the New Zealand Ministry of Justice actually has a set of principles for use of RJ approaches in sexual violence. The first principle they use is that the process has to be victim/survivor driven. It has to respect the right of the victim survivor to hold the offender accountable. It recognises the rebalancing of power between the victim survivor and the offender, and that this is the key to victims' healing. So they see restorative justice as one of the strategies that can be used for the victim, but it's definitely not the only one. The second principle is that processes are designed to maximise both opportunities to experience a sense of justice and for the chances of healing, and to minimise the chances of further harm. So I'm not sure that all those principles get us a huge way in the debate over whether we should be using conferencing, etc., where there's sexual violence. But again, the standard criminal justice system's performance in this area is traditionally so poor that it may be that even if the restorative system isn't perfect, that it can do a hell of a lot more good potentially than the conventional systems. But we do have to be concerned that any further contact a victim of this sort has with the offender could do further harm to that victim. All right, so that's the first topic we want to discuss is, are there some areas where we shouldn't be using restorative justice? The two big ones that we look at are domestic violence and sexual violence. And at the moment, it's sort of unsettled. We can see an awful lot of danger involved for the victim in both, but we can also potentially see that the system could work better than the current system. As flawed as it is, it could still be better than the current system, which we know is terribly flawed. The other topic I want to touch on is, are there certain types of offender that we should be more cautious of using these processes with? And again, a lot of this has come out of, cycles of review, with these ideas being very new, with there certainly being a bit of enthusiasm, sometimes over-enthusiasm, for trying something that's new, something that seems to work, and then a need to pull back and be critical and review, well, is this the case for everyone? Is this a universal situation? Are there some people who face more harm or more danger from these alternative processes? So there's a few different categories. We're going to look at Indigenous offenders, female offenders, and young offenders. So first of all, in terms of Indigenous offenders, restorative justice was originally sold with a whole lot of hype around this being more responsive to Indigenous needs and based in Indigenous cultures, were more based in this idea of restorative justice. As time has gone on, a lot of Indigenous activists have said, well, no one asked us. People just kind of assumed that that this was the case. So there was definitely in the implementation of these processes a lack of proper consultation and discussion with members of the Indigenous community. And also just the factual situation that people have pointed to, that there are a lot of Indigenous justice, because in small communities that don't have a state, a lot of the justice systems are quite retributive. They're based on physical punishment, Now, there's a whole complicated issue about, whether you can punish someone physically and then reintegrate them into society. And I certainly know Australian First Nations people have said that one of the purposes of that immediate physical punishment is that once it's done, and we don't speak about the crime again, and the person's reintegrated into the community. How the victim sits in that is all very complicated. So just saying, these new modern systems of Western justice are totally compliant, totally consistent with Indigenous ideas and beliefs, has proven not to be right. And worse than that, in terms of the stats on reoffending, studies have shown that restorative justice has no impact on preventing and reducing reoffending. So that's troubling, and that's a bit of a problem where we are trying to prove that this is going to be a system that's going to be better and produce better outcomes, that we actually find that Indigenous offenders do not respond to restorative justice in the same way. Well, certainly there's no reduction in reoffending. The next section that has been critiqued is female offenders, and that's complicated by the fact that there aren't that many female offenders in the scheme of things, and that there's a whole lot of additional issues in terms of stigmatizing female offenders on the basis of not performing in relation to gender roles. So a lot of the critique here has happened in the area of violence, where researchers have found that female violence, particularly on other women, is different to male violence. It exists in a very, very different, much more complicated social context, and that to be overly simplistic, the model that you have blokes getting into a fight and then someone says, "Oh, I'm sorry," and they shake hands and agree to do better for later on, isn't so simple when we're talking about female offenders. And female offenders already face stigmatization for behaving in a way inconsistent with gender norms and gender stereotypes, and this is a special problem with this violent crime. So that's an area that again needs more research, and because there are so few, comparatively few female offenders, it's going to be much slower in terms of getting that information together. And the last one, which is may seem quite surprising, is the appropriateness of the use of RJ for young offenders. And it can be surprising because this has been the most successful use of these ideas and these processes. We have a stage of access where we can stop people who are in delinquent career paths to go on to further crime and all those other things. But there have been concerns raised that, first of all, younger people aren't as developmentally advanced and are unable to freely consent to being part of the process. They don't necessarily fully understand voluntariness. They may be more suggestible. They may be more likely to be induced to be part of a process where it's against their interests. And more significantly, I think, is that many young offenders don't have the communication skills to be involved in these sort of processes, so they end up at a disadvantage. Possibly not more of a disadvantage than they are in a trial, but possibly you might have like a sympathetic magistrate who can actually understand the position of a young offender in a situation where if the responsibility goes over to the offender to represent tell their story and represent their side, that they may not have the skills to do that. So it's interesting that there's been a little bit of a backlash is too strong a word, but a bit of a stepping back in terms of young offenders and thinking about, well, are we sure we're doing this that's going to have the best outcomes for young offenders? Or are we, again, exposing them to dangers and a situation where they may, it may not lead to long-term benefits in terms of, desistance from crime. So next week we're going to look at some of the current research agenda, and it's definitely going to flow on from some of those issues that we've raised this week.